You're listening to episode 326.
Welcome to Transforming Missions Podcast, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Disciples make disciples. This could be a really short podcast. So this week's Masterclass is focused on discipleship. You have heard us on the podcast focus on a congregational disciple-making pathway using the acronym of HOPE, where the H stands for hospitality, reaching out and receiving new people. The O is offering Christ, inviting people to make a commitment to Jesus. Practicing the faith is the P, engaging in the means of grace. And then finally, the E is engagement and acts of service and justice beyond the walls of the local church. And I'll link to a series of Tim's articles on the show notes page for this episode, where he walks through hope in several ways. To get us started today, Tim, I'm wondering what you can highlight for us about congregational discipleship pathways.
I like that question. May I be snarky to begin with? I'll start by saying, have one.
Even if it's not hope?
Even if it's not hope. But what better way to have a pathway as to offer hope? But the deal is that many churches, I had a professor once that said, when you aim at nothing, you usually hit it. If you're going to have a pathway of making disciples, then you have to have a pathway. So you need one, and you need to be intentional about it. So it's not like people show up and eventually somebody says, well, I'd like to become a member of the church, or I want to be baptized. And then you baptize them. And then what do you do with them then? We're all on a journey here. And the church has the opportunity to be intentional about that journey. The other thing about this, Sara, and we've talked about this before, and that is, you've got a mission and you're on a pathway now. You're making disciples. You're growing as disciples. You just don't say you have one because the superintendent asks for it. You actually use it. And in my thinking, a disciple-making pathway would be the center of everything you do. So everything you do is helping you become a disciple of Jesus. Everything.
So maybe that's a question that we need to answer before we go any farther. What or who is a disciple?
Well, another good question. Not all church members are disciples. All disciples may be a part of a community of faith somewhere, though. A disciple is at its very root in terms of the Greek is a student, a follower. As we talk about disciples, they may be Christ-centered believers in Jesus who put their faith into action is really what they are. So when we're talking about making disciples, I would say it this way. We're becoming who God created us to be. We talk about it being followers of Jesus. So that's what I'm talking about. When everything we do, we are becoming who God created us to be. The church should be the place that when you show up, yes, it needs to be a safe place. And yes, it should be a place where you grow in your faith. The bottom line is growing in your faith and being safe is a place where you become who God created you to be. And that is, if you really have to have an answer to that, is where you love one another as you've been loved by God through Jesus. And you get sent out into the rest of the world to what? Love people the way you've been loved.
So what I'm now wondering is developing a discipleship pathway. I've seen a couple of things happen. It becomes an intellectual exercise for a committee to put something down on paper, and then it fails to get embodied because it's been a committee exercise instead of seeking to live out your faith and invite people to be a part of growing and following Jesus. On the other scenario that I've seen most frequently is that there are pieces of a pathway that might exist for a local congregation, but there are also pieces missing. So what wisdom might you offer to folks who don't have a pathway or only have a part of the pathway?
Sarah, it's been part of our work together, you and me, when we talk about hope, that hope is a pattern for a pathway. Hospitality, offering Christ, practicing the faith, and then engaging the community. So let me start with hope and jump off to a place where you say there may be only pieces. If you could identify hospitality in your congregation, and that doesn't mean coffee and donuts. It means becoming people who can welcome everyone into your life as well as into your church. And let's say you're not good at hospitality. Okay, you got offering Christ. Well, the preacher's going to do that. I'm not going to do that. So practicing the faith. We've got small groups and we've got Sunday school classes. Okay, start with small groups and Sunday school classes as practicing the faith. We do mission trips. And we feed people in the community. Okay, you're engaging the community in a way at that point. So start there, but then add to that. As you grow in your faith and as you grow as a follower of Jesus, as a disciple, how are you including people into your life, reaching out and receiving people? How are those people making a difference in your life? And then how are you beginning to not only articulate in your words, but how do you live your life in such a way that you're telling people about Jesus? I mean, how powerful would it be that somebody'd say, I want to be related to that person because of the way you live your life?
Yeah.
I'm jumping way ahead, but I know that when we talk about offering Christ in our culture, in the church, we have reduced that down to faith sharing. There's nothing wrong with faith sharing, but we have reduced it down to a place that if I can't talk about my faith, then that's not my gift. I'm going to give you a Greek word for that. That's baloney. If you can't talk about Jesus and the way you live with Jesus, then you need to strengthen your relationship with Jesus. That's the way I'd say it. So I'm off on something else. Did I get us? Help me get us back on track.
No, I think we're on track. You've named it. Start where people are. Start with what you have and build from there and begin to incorporate the other aspects of a pathway so that people know not only what is expected of them, but how to continue deepening their journey with Jesus. And go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're gonna answer my question.
Well, when you said faith sharing, and people think that offering Christ is all about faith sharing, I was sitting here thinking, everybody has a story. And most people want to talk about their story. Those stories become a little bit more of a challenge when you ask about the God story in the midst of that. And part of what you have helped me to see over our ministry together is that as we share those God stories, not only are we being formed in our faith, but we're helping other people to become more aware of who Jesus is in their life as well. So maybe at the risk of poking a bear, what is a God story and why is it important to share our God stories?
Sarah, I think the place where you start, again, you're starting where people are. So you got to start with your experience or your encounter with Jesus. I'm assuming you're a follower of Jesus. You've had an encounter with Jesus somewhere. And so you start with that encounter. Where have you met Jesus? Where have you encountered Jesus? And I'm one of these that believe if you've seen Jesus, you've seen God. That comes from John. And so it's the same when you say, where have you experienced God or where have you seen God? That would be a God sighting. So you could talk about, I've experienced God, and these are the places that God's become real to me. That becomes part of your God story. Where some people, if they're timid about talking about God, it's where their faith hits the road. I mean, it's where they've really had to put faith into action. The difficulty is the church has not created a space for people to practice telling their stories. So this is where I got in trouble with being focused to a fault, and that is you already have a structure in place to give people an opportunity to practice telling their stories. Every meeting that you have, you don't have to do it every meeting, but every meeting that you have, give people an opportunity to talk about where they've experienced God in the past since they were together last. You and I were talking in preparation for this podcast, and I just said, it's what you focus on, it's what you see. If you're going to buy a red Volkswagen, then every car on the road begins to be a red Volkswagen. If you're going to be focused, if you're looking for Jesus in the community, you begin to see Jesus in the community. And if you're talking about it in the church in a meeting, and then you get to say, oh, that's what that means. Then when you get outside in the community, you begin to say, yeah, there he is. This is how this is working. And then you get excited. I mean, I don't know if a whole lot of people get excited about going to finance meetings, but then you get excited about going to the finance meeting because you get to say, the last time we were here, I heard this. This is where I saw Jesus. Can you imagine having meetings like that in the church? That kind of helps people get on fire for this. And it's not something you conjure up. It's that you begin to be focused and you begin to look for it.
So you've already started to answer this question, but where do we share our God stories?
Where do we share our God stories?
Yeah. I mean, you've mentioned in meetings. Is the purpose of sharing our God story going to stand on a street corner?
So that's a good question. Because what I was going to say is that you will have opportunities to talk about your experiences at any given time. It's not that you're creating a space by going out on a corner and proclaiming what it is. Sara, it's kind of like sometimes telling your God story isn't shouting it from the rooftops, because, if somebody has cancer and you find out that it's malignant, you don't go out on the porch when the neighbor says, how's your wife? You don't shout and say, well, it's cancer, it's malignant. It's kind of like you come together and say it wasn't what we expected. Sometimes talking about God is that way. It's not shouting it from the rooftops. You all need to know what I know. It may very well be, he said, this is really crazy, but I saw Jesus at the grocery store. And that might be in a conversation, this tells you how old I am, around the water cooler at the office. When it's authentic, you actually begin to feel and know the appropriate times to talk. And in fact, there'll be times when you want to say something and the words won't come because it'll be so deep that the first thing that goes out of the deepness of the relationship and what you've seen is your breath. So it's not always easy to talk about, but we all have those experiences with God's love. Even if we don't know that it's God's love, it's when we begin to say, this is what this is. I mean, how can you say that God's not in a child that runs across the room and throws their arms around your neck? Maybe something that's so common to you, but man, this is a human being that loves another human being.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful illustration of the simplicity at the same time as a profound moment of encountering Jesus. It doesn't have to be a mountaintop experience. That's not what we're naming. So I'm gonna shift a little bit here, thinking about the world in which we live, and you've heard me say it this way, that there are more people like me who did not grow up in a church or having a faith community around them in the world today. So helping people move from being unaware of Jesus to seeking Jesus and ultimately following and being committed to Jesus is a journey. It's a process that takes time. And I'm thinking specifically of John Wesley and the recognition and how he named God's prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace.
So we're going back to a discipleship pathway is what we're talking about, right?
Yes, we are. And I want to put a little twist on it, because a few episodes ago, I remember saying we never graduate from the pathway, but we can go deeper on the pathway. So if we can play that out a little bit, when we think about entry points into the local church, entry points into a relationship with Jesus, it starts with relationships, right? Many of the people who become a part of a church do so because someone invited them to come with them. It's because of the relationships. So can you offer for us some examples for the church as easy invitations? That might not be the best way to say it, but easy invitations to begin building relationships with people who might fall into that category specifically of being unaware of who Jesus is, or at the beginning of that journey.
Well, Sarah, I've left out some things that are really important, and I can't go back and pick them all up. But I think if we are intentional about a disciple-making pathway, then every invitation we have, whether it's for Vacation Bible School, whether it's other activities in the church, what's in the back of our mind all along is, how can we love people the way God's loved us? So in the church, there are ways to invite people, again, what would happen if at every fellowship dinner, and you're focused now upon a pathway and you're focused on the mission, that at every fellowship dinner, you were inviting people from the community to come be a part of the dinner. And then what you talked about at the dinner wasn't your next door neighbor, but about the God sightings. Everything we do, part of the mission, and that becomes part of the pathway, because it's not about, we can invite the community to come and be a part of it, but it's about who we are as followers of Jesus more than trying to make somebody be a follower of Jesus.
Well, I'm thinking of the things that we often program in the life of a congregation, whether it's Vacation Bible School. I'm thinking about that because we're getting into summertime, or things like a marriage ministry or some sort of financial ministry for adults, of a challenge or a life transition that is happening for people that the church tries to program towards in terms of addressing. All of those things really fill a calendar and take time, energy, and resources to make happen. And that can be a good thing, but if I can say it this way, they're programs. And to move from a church with programs to a church where people embrace disciples making disciples, i.e. there are relationships that happen, we need to be intentional about developing those relationships that focus on disciple making and faith sharing. I'm thinking of, and it can be formal, it can be informal, mentoring relationships, prayer partners. I think most often we try to do it with small groups, and sometimes that can work too, but small groups can also get programmed. Tim, what's our next curriculum that we're doing in our small group? And we miss the point of being in relationship with one another, because Tim, the pastor, can't program that for you. You need to be a part of that. So I offer that little rant, if you will, to ask this question: what transformation would you say needs to happen for people to develop discipling relationships so disciples are making disciples instead of a church staff trying to program disciples? It's not an either or. We're not going to get rid of church programs, but they're a starting place, not an ending place.
Right. So I'm going to go back and say that our mission is to help people grow into being who God created them to be. That's what our job is. So everything we do helps us get to that point. I do think that as we grow and mature, there are probably questions that we can ask each other as we are growing into. I've got two things going on in my mind. We're growing in faith, but in all the programming, we said this in the last episode, if all the programming is focused on the mission or is missionally oriented, then we're providing places for people to be able to develop the relationships, have the conversations. The pathway has a place for the means of grace. The means of grace doesn't have to be a program that you're sitting down and people participating in. The means of grace can be a part of everything we do. So that we're structuring things around a pathway of hope. We're participating in things like prayer and Bible study. We're finding ways to be able to identify where God is at work, and that we are being able to articulate where we see God at work. We even actually begin to want to engage the community, because it's not about addressing the needs of the community. It's about being in relationship to the community in such a way that we can love one another the way that God's loved us. The needs get addressed because we're loving the way we've been loved. There's just a part of me that thinks if you start so much of our work in the church, Sara, the pathways, the mission, we're always reaching up to touch bottom. Why don't we just start out with loving God and then allowing God to lead us to the people we need to be? So I'm off of what you asked me, but that's where my mind's wandering at this moment.
So let me ask a different question from what you just named. What do we need to re-envision as it relates to disciple making?
I'm going to go back to something that you and I've talked about a lot, and that is I think we have to model it for others and then integrate it in everything we do.
It being
love, the mission.
Following Jesus.
The mission, following Jesus. That's not it. But following Jesus is who we are. Everything we do is to be about that. And I think we start with following Jesus, putting God's love into action, and integrating it in everything we do. I mean, I've said that how many different ways over and over. We give people the opportunity. We clear a space as we leaders model it. We create a space for people to practice doing those, loving one another, whether it's inside the church or outside the church. I mean, just asking the question, okay, you disagree with them. How can you love them in the midst of disagreement? And have a conversation before you live it out. But that whole idea of modeling and integrating, it came real to me by watching you do this through a ministry that you developed in a church. So I'm going to ask you I want you to give a good example. So with a ministry that you developed called Awaken the City, you would start out, and most of that was with teenagers, the people who got a lot out of it were the adults, because they were the overhearers, because you weren't talking directly to them. You were talking to the teenagers. And you'd start out by asking them maybe where they had their God stories, where had they seen Jesus? And you've described that in a way that is much better than I can keep talking about it. So what happened when you started asking them those questions at the beginning of the week, and then what happened by the end of the week?
Yeah, so let me take one step back and say we started where we knew a group of people were at. And that was, there was this thing that youth groups, student ministry did during the summer that was called a mission trip. And I grew weary of going places, other places in the country, other places in the world, and then coming back and having people say to me, well, how do we do this here? Well, why haven't we been doing this here all along was what was running through my mind. And so to model that in a different way and to help people encounter what does it mean to be a disciple, we put together a week-long immersion experience in the city where they had an opportunity to serve in a variety of capacities, but that started every day with a Bible study that led to a question that then took them out into the community to serve with people, that then at the end of the day, they came back for a worship service to celebrate where they had experienced Jesus. And that whole week began with us doing what we called a prayer walk around the community. It was an introduction to that community because for many of the people who were serving in that context, it was a very different context than they had been living in. And so it was okay, I want you to see this before you do anything because you're going to encounter something different. And we would come back after that prayer tour and do the same thing that we did every night and ask the question, where did you see Jesus? Where did you encounter Jesus? And inevitably, I would get these blank stares, these glazed over eyes, like, I don't know what you're talking about, or where you're trying to go. And usually what would happen is there was an adult in the room, youth leader, an adult youth leader who said, well, I'll share something. And sometimes they truly did have something to share. So other times they were just uncomfortable with the silence that was happening. And often that first night, it was one or two people, usually the adults, who would share. By the end of the week, because we had introduced a pattern and continued to invite people to name in different ways, simply by asking the question in a different way, it was simple things like, instead of where did you see Jesus, where did you encounter the love of God? It's the same question. So we would do that over and over again. By the end of the week, I would end up having to say to the group that was gathered, let's say it was a group of 35 people, we have 90 minutes, there are 35 of you. Each one of you cannot give a 15-minute sermon on where you encountered Jesus because we don't have that much time. So we can either hear from a couple of you that give us very extended stories, or we can hear from many of you about one or two sentences about where you encountered Jesus, because they had learned how to pay attention to where God was moving in their midst, and they had something to share. It boiled down to, are you paying attention to where God's moving in your midst? And at the beginning of the week, they had never been asked to do that. And over the course of the week, what did we really do? We helped them to learn how to follow Jesus by being in relationship with one another and the community that they were serving in. It was that simple. we make discipleship way harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, so that could very well be the pattern that you develop in your congregation, is that you're asking the question every time you gather and allowing people then to respond in ways that they understand. And the things that work, that help prime the pump, again, are their means of grace, or having conversation about every activity and how does that help us see Jesus, or how does that reflect Jesus, so that when it's all over and you're doing evaluation, it's not, well, we ran out of food or we did whatever. You're talking about Jesus showed up. We were doing, when we did this. Sara, the best story that I know for me is the Sunday that in one of the churches I was in, the Sunday that one of the alcoholics who had emphysema, and he showed up and he said, I'd like to sing. And we didn't know whether we wanted him to sing or not or whatever, but he sang the Lord's Prayer. He stood and sang the Lord's Prayer. And everyone who was present, there was a transformation that took place, because then the people who gathered for a little worship service who were off the street were no longer looked at as being those people. They were beginning to be, and not only our guests, but they began to be part of us. Yeah. And that's, and God shows up in strange and mysterious ways at times, always unexpectedly. But the reality is God's there all the time. It's how we have been focused on being able to see God that it begins to be a surprise, because that's the first thing. God surprised us. The next thing in growing in that faith and helping people grow in that faith is that you begin to expect to see Jesus. And the last thing of that is that you are actually aware that God's with you all the time and is showing up in people around you every day. So that's part of what that faith formation is. I'm an old guy. I want to do it face to face with people. I'm sure there are other ways that it happens, however we can develop those relationships. Thank you for sharing that story, but you obviously kicked off a whole lot of other stuff in my mind.
Well, and part of what I want to offer to what you said is, when we experienced those weeks, I ended up doing, I think most of our listeners know this, I ended up doing my doctoral work based on that whole experience. And I was really setting out to compare how a week-long immersion experience was different than just a one-time or an ongoing small group experience, thinking that the time and the intensity made a difference in what happened in people's faith formation. And that wasn't it at all. Instead, what I found was it was the reflection. It was simply asking those questions about, where did you encounter Jesus? Where did you see Jesus? How did you encounter the love of God in Jesus? And creating that space for reflection that led to the transformation. It didn't matter if it was 5 days long, 1 day long, one morning, one evening, for 6 weeks. If the space for conversation and reflection did not exist, transformation didn't happen.
There's part of the pathway.
Period, hard stop. So when you get to the place that you think all of this conversation is taking too much time and we have other things to do, go back and play what I just said again. Without the space for conversation and reflection, transformation does not happen. I don't want to end us on a negative note, but could there be a reason why we're challenged in disciple making in our local congregations?
Sarah, I think it comes back to, again, the focus. And that if our focus is to become who God created us to be those followers of Jesus, to love one another as we've been loved, I think the reflection at that point helps us grow in depth. And that depth then is out of the depths that grows our response to God's love for us.
Yeah.
And that's part of the pathway. So you said you didn't want to end on a negative note. Let me tell you, the pathway is not to make church members. The pathway is to make disciples. Only with American Express does membership have its privileges. To be a member of the church is to love others as you've been loved by Jesus. That's what it means to be a member of the church.
That is a good word to end on. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about faith formation, discipleship, disciple making, whichever phrase, word you would like to use?
So yes, there is something, and that's just this. If you hear a lot of talk about loving your neighbor, God's love for you, and you're not really sure what that is, let's have a conversation about letting God love you in a way that your life has changed. Right? And it boggles my mind, Sarah, that we've got churches that cannot talk about the love of God. They talk a lot about the wrath of God, and they talk about the law of God. But somewhere I need people to meet Jesus, because Jesus puts all that in a different perspective. And let's build a pathway in each of our congregations so that we can lead each other into the presence of a living God who loves us.
Amen. Thank you for helping us to remember and reclaim and re-envision or think again about what disciple making can look like in the local church and needs to look like. As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/326.
When you leave this podcast, you're actually in the mission field where people need a kind, caring, supportive, encouraging word. And God's already put that word in you through Jesus. The joy and peace of this life comes in sharing what you've received. So go in peace and experience the joy in the name of the living God who loves you in Jesus and who empowers you to be a follower of Jesus by the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.